This is the Friday edition of Back to the Bible. Today, Pastor Nat Crawford continues his interview with author and associate professor of theology, Dr. Michael Licona. They're going to be discussing the reality and relevance of the resurrection and why it's so important to ask questions and find answers for your faith. We'll begin in a moment, but first, this is the last day to request your copy of Win the Day. The devotions in this issue focus on daily steps for walking in truth and peace, even during chaotic times. So give us a call. We'd like to send it to you as a gift to thank you for your financial support. But again, this offer ends today, so call 1-800-759-2425, 1-800-759-2425, or visit backtothebible.org. Now let's join Pastor Nat with special guest, Dr. Michael Licona.
Today's special guest is author and associate professor of theology, Dr. Michael Licona. Mike, great to have you back on the show today.
Thanks, Nat. Great to be back with you.
Well, last time we talked about, the book of Galatians and the gospel and the reliability of Paul's message. And today we're going to take it down a path that you are very familiar with as well, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Before we get into some of the more specifics, and more specifically, actually, the objections to the resurrection, I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to know a little bit more about you and what brought you into the study of the resurrection.
Well, it was the fall of 1985, and I was having some questions about my faith. It wasn't anything that I'd learned. It was just a matter of just reflecting and thinking, I'm a Christian. I was raised in a Christian family, have gone to a Christian university, and I think I've got this relationship with God. I'm convinced I do, but what if I'd been brought up in Afghanistan? Would I be a Muslim? If I'd been brought up in China, would I be an atheist? Or India, a Hindu? And are they just as convinced about their worldviews as I am mine? Have I deceived myself? Does it even matter what I believe? And this just sent me on a whirlwind with my faith, and it was really disturbing. And so one of my roommates suggested I go see Gary Habermas. Well, I was doing a master's degree in New Testament studies. He was in Christian apologetics. Gary Habermas was and is an apologist, a philosopher. So I had never had him for a class, and I went in and knocked on his door. He invited me in. He was very collegial, and he says, what's your questions? And he didn't put me down at all. I felt totally comfortable with it, expressing how I was experiencing doubts. And he says, I've experienced doubts before too, and there are a lot of people who experience doubts. And he told me that when Antony Flew, who was perhaps the most influential atheist philosopher of the latter part of the 20th century, that he said that he doubted his atheism often. These are just important questions. They're things to reflect on a whole lot. Right. And some of us are just that way. We're just wired that way. So he pointed me to the resurrection. He said, look, if Jesus was raised, Christianity's true. Jesus said his resurrection. He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it. And in John chapter 2, he says this. And then throughout Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he talks about, like in Matthew and Luke, the sign of Jonah. Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish. He'd be in the heart of the earth and rise from the dead. Predicted his death and imminent death and subsequent resurrection. So if Christ was not raised from the dead, he's a false prophet, a failed Messiah. No rational person should follow him. But if he did rise from the dead, then it seems to me he did so in confirmation of his personal radical claims, and it gives us something very serious to think about. And so that just became the thing. Christ rose, Christianity's true, period. If he didn't rise from the dead, Christianity's false. Let's go look for a different worldview.
And that's one of the things I've really appreciated about you and getting to know you is your honesty about your struggles and your doubt. I think it's actually a good thing. But that led you to be an expert in the area of the resurrection.
I think this is important. I'm glad you brought this up, Nat, because this is important to those listeners, of your listeners who experience doubt. John the Baptist experienced doubt. And the Gospels tell us that he sends a couple of his disciples to Jesus. Are you the one, or are we to expect someone else? He's doubting. He feels like he's been abandoned by God at that point.
Right.
Yes, he heard the voice from heaven. Yes, he knew all the prophecies and the stories from Elizabeth, his mother, and all that. But he's doubting because life stinks at that point. And it's like he's rotting away in prison, and it's like, well, Jesus isn't doing anything about it. And so he's experiencing emotional doubt. God, Where are you? And many of us experience this kind of doubt at times. And look at Jesus' response. He doesn't rebuke John.
Right.
He tells his disciples to go, John's disciples to go back and says, tell John what you see and hear. The blind see, the deaf hear. They'd seen the miracles. The blind see, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the gospel is preached to the poor, and blessed are those who do not stumble on account of me. Which, by the way, this is the end that's predicted of the Messiah. He would do these exact things at the very end. I think it's Isaiah 66, and it's also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they go back, and then now Jesus is going to be honest with the crowd. He says, look, when you came out to see John, would you come to see a person wearing great clothes? Nope. You got to go to the king's palace for that. Did you come back here to see a reed blown back and forth by the wind? He knew John was doubting. He says, no, let me tell you who you came to see. A prophet, yes, a great prophet. In fact, no greater man has been born of woman than John the Baptist. So while John is doubting, Jesus praises him. And later on, when he rises from the dead, and you got doubting Thomas, which, by the way, all of them, except maybe John, all of them doubted the women's testimony. You come back and doubting Thomas, and Jesus says, Thomas, you've seen and believed? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. In other words, that word blessed, makarios, he's saying you can flourish. You have seen and believed, guess what? Those who have not seen and yet believe can still flourish, be blessed in their walk with God. And that's something for all of us to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's so important. I often thinking about, Dan Brown. I've talked a lot about Dan Brown and his deconversion. He had doubts, and so he went and talked to a local priest, and he told the now famous author, good boys don't ask those type of questions. And it sent him on a trajectory so far away from truth that he's doing a lot more damage than he is good. But I've told my kids, if you ever have doubt, good. Wrestle and let's talk about it together. That's healthy. And I think when people, our listeners, people at the churches, whoever, when they say, it's okay, don't be afraid of truth, don't be afraid of pursuing truth, let doubt be leveraged to strengthen your faith. I think that is so freeing, and that's what I want for our listeners. It's what you want for the people you encounter, because you know that there is truth out there, but it takes some wrestling sometimes to get there. But I love what you said, looking back at John the Baptist, and even Thomas. Thomas, I really appreciate also, because I don't think he really was a doubting Thomas, as people have said, because think about it, earlier on, Jesus is saying, let's go, and everyone's else like, I don't think so, and Thomas is like, look, I'll die for you, Lord, let's go. So here was a man who was so strong, and he still had the questions. Great. That reminds me of me. It reminds me of you. So doubt isn't a sin. It's a natural part of our human being. So let's lean into it and let it lead us to truth. Okay, I move on. I digress. Sorry. This is good. We're having a good conversation here. But when we talk about faith and we talk about doubt, I think it's only reasonable that we have questions about the resurrection. And so that took you on this path. And so let's start digging into it. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lays out the gospel message. It says that Christ died for our sins. Paul said that Jesus was buried. He was raised on the third day. He appeared to over 500 people, including the disciples and more. I believe this. You believe this. But why should we believe this, Mike?
Well, we do have this, not only are Paul and the Jerusalem apostles proclaiming this, okay? And we have this from Paul here, which takes us back to the Jerusalem apostles. We have it multiply attested, of course, in the Gospels. But we have reports in many ancient sources that these same disciples who are out proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus are willing to suffer continuously and willing to die for this testimony. That doesn't mean that their testimony is correct, but the fact that they're willing to die for it suggests they are sincere in their belief about what they're saying. So it's like when a Muslim jihadist dies as a suicide bomber, and let's say they're using that rather than forcing women and mentally handicapped people and children from doing it. But let's say, they volunteer to do it. They are doing it because of what they believe. That doesn't mean that Islam is true, but it means that they sincerely believe it's true. And this shows with the disciples' willingness to suffer and willing to go to their deaths, and we know at least several of them did, but we know that they all did suffer for their gospel proclamation, and all were willing to die for their faith. That suggests that they sincerely believed what they were proclaiming. Liars make poor martyrs. So the disciples were not only claiming that Jesus rose and had appeared to them They actually believed it. And so what the task is, as you have Dale Allison, who teaches at Princeton, he talks about these disciples really believed that they had experienced the risen Jesus, that he had appeared to them. What led them to this belief? He says that is the prize puzzle of New Testament research.
Wow. Well, I mean, I've heard you say this before, that, they claim to see Jesus, risen Jesus. So there's two options: they did or they didn't, right? I mean, those are the two options. And so if they didn't, one of the things a lot of people say, I have an atheist friend who said, Nat, you don't get it. They're just a bunch of liars. Now, granted, liars make poor martyrs, but come on now. I mean, couldn't they have lied? Or couldn't they be distorting the truth? I mean, talk about that a little bit, because that's such a common pushback.
Yeah, well, of course, we can't get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify our conclusions. We have to talk in terms of what's plausible, what's probable here. And we do that with all of history, by the way, okay? So how plausible is it to think that all of these disciples were willing to suffer horribly, and that they were willing to go to their deaths for something they knew was a lie? That is implausible. In fact, I can tell you this, having surveyed a lot of the literature written by scholars, and even Gary Habermas even more, has done it even more. I can tell you, I'm not aware of any scholars in recent times, and when I say recent times, probably the last 70 years, maybe even a century. I'm not aware of any scholars who would propose that the disciples lied. And I'm talking about scholars who study this stuff. Right. Even people like Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic or an atheist, depends what day of the week and how he feels at that time. He says that the evidence is there that the disciples really, truly, authentically, genuinely believed that Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to them. Now, he thinks they probably experienced hallucinations, but lying, no, they really believed it. The evidence is there, good enough to suggest it.
The idea of peace seems a far cry from what we hear on the news, on social media, or even as we interact with others throughout the day. But God knows our need for peace, and in this month's issue of Win the Day, Pastor Nat shares the truth about it.
There's a peace Jesus offers that is not of this world. And when we accept it, we no longer have to be troubled or afraid. And the best part? This peace isn't temporary. In fact, it's guaranteed to last forever.
Win the Day, Daily Steps for Walking in Truth and Peace, is our gifted thank you for your support of Back to the Bible. But today is the last day to request your copy, so call soon. 1-800-759-2425. That number again is 1-800-759-2425. Or to give online, visit us at backtothebible.org. backtothebible.org. Back to the Bible continues now with Pastor Nat Crawford and special guest Michael Licona.
Joining me today is author and associate professor of theology, Dr. Michael Licona, and you've just pretty much made it unexplainable that the apostles would have lied and would have died for a lie. That just doesn't make sense. That's not a reasonable conclusion. But you did mention hallucination. Okay, again, I've talked to people online, I interact with them, they'll say, okay, clearly they thought they saw him, so they must have hallucinated. Is that a plausible explanation?
It really sounds like it would be at first, wouldn't it, Nat?
Yeah.
But when you come to understand a little about hallucinations, then it becomes problematic. You see, hallucinations are false perceptions of an external reality. So when someone experiences a visual hallucination, they have a false perception of seeing something that isn't really there. And visual hallucinations aren't the only kind. You can have something where you hear a voice, an auditory hallucination, but maybe you thought someone called your name, but they didn't. Or you smelled something that's not there, or taste something that's not there. Most of us have dreams where we're falling and we wake up. That's called a kinesthetic hallucination, a sense of motion. Or maybe when we got our first mobile phones, we put these things on vibrate when we were sitting in a meeting or a sermon or something, and we thought it went off, and we picked it up and looked at it and said, nobody loves me. And so that was a false alarm. That is called a tactile hallucination. The group most likely to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. And approximately 50% of them, in multiple studies done over the years, approximately 50% experience a hallucination of some sort. But only 7% experience a visual hallucination. So you got a couple problems here. Number one, the percentage of percipients is too high because he appeared to the 12. He appeared to more than 500 at one time. He appeared to all of the apostles.
Right.
You're looking at 100%, at least for all the apostles in the 12. Then you're looking at group appearances. So because hallucinations, you're having a false sensory perception of something that's not there. It's occurring in the mind of an individual. It has no external reality. So in that sense, it's like a dream. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Hawaii. You and I are in Hawaii. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation tonight. You can't do that and participate in the same dream because the dream has no external reality to it. You can't participate in the same dream. It's not going on. Hallucinations aren't contagious in that sense. They're not group appearances. So you've got the problem with the multiple group appearances as well, to the 12, to more than 500 at one time, to all the apostles. And that's not included in any of the other appearances we find in the Gospels that aren't mentioned in that oral tradition. And then finally, you got Paul. Paul isn't grieving over Jesus' death. Paul believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see.
Right.
I could go on, there's some other reasons, but those I would think would be the top three that I would give on why the hallucination hypothesis doesn't work. In fact, it's probably the most popular alternative explanation offered by skeptics today. They just call it visions, but they mean hallucinations by that. But it's perhaps the weakest, or at least one of the very weakest out there.
So it's not plausible that they lied. It's not plausible they had a hallucination. Okay, but what about survival? I mean, isn't it possible that people survived crucifixion? Jesus could have survived and walked off, from the grave and said, hey, guys, it's me, I'm good. I mean, isn't that possible?
Of course, anything's possible, too. You could say Jesus was an alien from a parallel universe somewhere, and he came to Earth to try to deceive us, and that was his PhD work. He had to deceive human beings to think that he was alive, risen from the dead, and divine. But you got to look and say, okay, something is possible, but that doesn't mean it's plausible or that we should believe it. Okay, so what about Jesus surviving his execution? We only have two accounts in antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion. One, Herodotus mentions one, Josephus mentions another. But in both cases, both were intentionally removed from their crosses. And in the case of Josephus, the best medical care that Rome offered at that point was administered to the three. In spite of that, two of the three that were removed from their crosses during Josephus' time, intentionally, two of the three still died. So even if Jesus had been removed from his cross prematurely and medically assisted, his chances of survival weren't good at all. Second, we don't have a scrap of evidence. Nothing, zero, zilch, nothing that would suggest that Jesus was removed while alive or provided any medical care whatsoever, much less Rome's best. And historians can't just go with possibilities. Any goofball online who's blogging can say anything they want, because the only credentials you need to post a blog online is you have to be able to breathe. All right, but historians have to look at the data and go with the data. And so without at least equally good data that Jesus survived his death somehow, the historian at least must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. There's more that I could say too. Let me just give you one more though, quickly. If given scourging and crucifixion and how these things were described in antiquity, you've got Josephus and others who describe scourging itself as exposing bones and arteries and veins. So, I mean, you were really just getting your skin shredded. So you get Jesus who's been scourged so brutally that he finds it impossible to carry his cross all the way, and they got to enlist the services of a stranger, Simon of Cyrene. So Jesus is scourged brutally, and then he's crucified, nails through his hands and feet. Do we really imagine that just, 36, 40 hours later, a day and a half later, he's crucified on Friday afternoon, he appears to others Sunday morning? Do we really think that if that actually happened, that he's coming forth alive, that he's going to look and be able to convince others he's the risen Prince of Life? The guy wouldn't even be able to walk, probably couldn't even stand up. His body would be oozing, he'd have infection, he would have fever. He would be in terrible shape. They'd be wanting to get him a doctor not worship him as the risen Prince of Life. So, there's only a handful of people, maybe, as far as I know, one relevant scholar today who even thinks it's possible that Jesus may have survived his crucifixion.
Well, and going back to what you said earlier, that definitely would not convince Paul. So, I mean, again, as you've talked about it, there's only one reasonable conclusion. Jesus rose from the dead. We're talking physically rose from the dead. And again, we have to be able to approach this logically and say, what is the best explanation? I heard one person say, well, what about his twin brother, Ted? Well, I don't know about any twin brother Ted, but I guess it's possible, but that's not going to inspire a movement by any means.
I tell you, the guy that proposed that first, his name's Greg Cavan. I debated him back in, I think, 2012. Good guy. He's an atheist philosophy professor in California. Mm-hmm. And he told me before that debate that he did his doctoral dissertation proposing that. He said that's the only likely explanation other than resurrection. But before the debate, he says he doesn't even take that anymore.
Oh, my goodness. Well, there you go. So, I mean, it's preposterous. But I think having this type of evidence is so helpful. And for us just to think through these alternative explanations, because those aren't refutations. We got to remember this as Christians. We must always be prepared to give a defense. We must always be ready to contend for the faith. And in today's hostile world of conflicting worldviews and ideas, just because someone claims something or retweets it or puts it on Facebook does not mean that it is in fact true. We are called to use the faculties that God has given us to actually ask questions and to look at it and see if it actually is reasonable. That's what you did, and it got you to the place where you are today. That's what I did, and it got to me where I am today. And that's why we would encourage our listeners and the people watching, don't just settle for a blind faith. Have reasons to believe. There's nothing unbiblical or ungodly about looking for evidence and seeing where it leads. And in my experience, it's always pointed back to truth. And we know that God is the source of that truth. I mean, that's what you discovered as well.
Yeah, 100% there.
So for anyone who is listening now and they're going, okay, I get it, but I still doubt. I'm still not, what about Jonah? What about a virgin birth? What about a universal flood? Mike, what do you say to those people who are still doubting maybe all these other fringe pieces? What does this reality of the resurrection do for them today?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have to realize in science there's a lot of unanswered questions.
Yep.
But you don't throw science out. You don't throw certain conclusions within science out because other conclusions we don't know the answers to. We can acknowledge that there are some tensions in some of these questions. Some of them we just don't know the answer to and may never know them this side of heaven. But what's important to recognize is that Christianity is true because Jesus rose from the dead. There's nothing out there that says everything in the Bible, it's an all or nothing, okay? That's something that we came up with, man-made came up with. But it's not anywhere in the Bible that says it's all true or none of it's true, all right? The truth of the matter is, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, period. Game, set, match. And it would remain true even if, let's say, there were some errors in the Gospels. I'm not saying there are errors in the Gospels, but even if there were, Jesus rose from the dead before any of the New Testament literature was written. And thousands came to Christ from the apostolic preaching before any of the New Testament literature was written. So any perceived errors in the Gospels, even if real, it wouldn't negate the truth of Christianity because it was true before then because Jesus rose from the dead. So it's important to recognize if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. Don't get hung up on these other things. We can ask these, we can debate these. They're interesting topics, but they don't undermine the truth of Christianity.
Amen, Mike. I appreciate your time today. Well, we would encourage you to go check out Mike's videos on YouTube as well as his website, Risen Jesus. God bless you. It's good spending time with you.
Thank you, Nat.
Thank you for joining us for Back to the Bible. Now, we filled this month's issue of Win the Day with devotions and daily steps for walking in truth and peace. And we'd like to send it to you as a gift to thank you for your financial support. So make your request today at 1-800-759-2425, 1-800-759-2425, or visit backtothebible.org.
Thank you for listening, and as always, stand firm, stand faithful, and stand on God's Word.